Everyone, welcome. I'm Sasha Killewald. I'm the director of the Stone Center for Inequality Dynamics. Thank you so much for being here today. As usual, there are sign-in sheets, I think, on the various tables. We'd appreciate it if you just sign in to let us know who you are. And if you think that talks like this are a kind of thing you might enjoy, please let us know. We would love to add you to our affiliates list to make sure you get announcements. For today's talk, we will save Q&A until the end, so please just hold your questions. It is my pleasure to welcome Shay O'Brien to our speaker series. It's great, especially to welcome her to Michigan Stone Center, given that she is currently a postdoc at MIT Stone Center and was previously a postdoc at Harvard Stone Center. So we are helping her collect all the bingo squares. She received her PhD in sociology from Princeton in 2023. And her work has been published in Socioeconomic Review, the British Journal of Sociology, and soon also in ASR. And her work has also been recognized with many awards, including from paper awards from both ASA's Inequality, Poverty, and Mobility section, as well as the Family section. And her dissertation was also recognized with the Theda Skocpol Dissertation Award from ASA's Comparative and Historical Sociology section. So please join me in welcoming Shay.
Can you all hear me? Great. Thank you so much for having me and for that great introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I've heard so many good things about the Stone Center here, and it's amazing to see it in person. So the talk I'm going to give today is on this paper called Kinship Interlocks, How the Intimate Exchange of Wealth, Status, and Power Generates Upper-Class Persistence. This is the one that's coming out in ASR kind of any day now. So if you like it, if you hate it, you'll be able to do so in more detail pretty soon. How the talk is going to work is I'll start out with an overarching example that really illustrates the key themes and the central question and argument of the paper. And then I'll take a step back and give you a roadmap for the rest of the talk. But let's jump in. So by any standard individual measure of demography, wealth, status, or power, these two women, Agnes Burke Marshall and Betty Hearn Aldridge, they look practically identical. Wait, hold on. I forgot to set my timer so I don't go over. Okay. So in terms of demographics, they were both white Protestant housewives who were born in the rural US South in the 1850s and who died in Dallas, Texas in the 1930s. They were both upper class in the sense that they were listed in these fancy books called social registers that I'll continue to mention. They're like an index of upper class families. They were high status, but they weren't the very highest status. Like they weren't debutantes, they weren't in the fanciest clubs. Neither had much political power by any measure. They never held office or were in any big political organizations. And they even died with the same amount of wealth, about $500,000 $2026. So again, by these individual measures, they look pretty identical. But Agnes's descendants melted into the middle and working classes within 1 or 2 generations, and Betty's are still very much entrenched in the Dallas upper class today. So the difference between these two women, it really speaks to this central century-old question in the social science of elites, which is, do elites or does the upper class persist or circulate over time? And a common underlying assumption to this question, which I think is shared by a lot of stratification research more broadly, is this idea that if you've got a lot of persistence, then that means you've got an aristocracy or an oligarchy. And if you've got a lot of circulation, maybe that means you've got more of a meritocracy or a democracy. And I think this assumption is shared by a lot of the general public in the States. So some of you may remember the Nepo baby discourse of 2023, which is kind of ongoing, where a lot of internet commentators and journalists were shocked to learn that their favorite celebrities and politicians were the children of celebrities and politicians. But the shock and dismay here was really based on this idea that if you've got these Nepo babies at the top, that means you've got an unfair, undemocratic society. And if you didn't have them, then you maybe have a more fair and democratic meritocracy. But there's this ultimately unresolvable question in mobility and elite persistence research, which is just how mobile is mobile and how persistent is persistent. I think much more, the reality is that some elites and upper class families persist and some do not. The Bush family definitely has persisted. So I think the question really is which persist and how do they do that and with what consequences for the rest of us? These processes are really important to understand because they shape not only who is richest, but who is rich the longest, and not only who ruled in 1900, but who rules today. So this is the Kennedy family. We've been hearing a bit too much about one of their heirs lately. So it all leads to my research question today, which is how do some families manage to entrench themselves in the upper class for many generations while others do not? So in the case of these two women, Agnes and Betty, I'll argue that whereas Agnes, the one whose family dropped out, they were only marginally upper class, Betty was in what I call a kinship interlock, which means that she was directly related to at least one economic, social, and political elite. And I'll get more into the nitty-gritty of these definitions later on, but for now I'll just say by upper class, I mean the set of families who collectively had significant wealth, status, and power. And by elite, I mean individuals who had, in Seamus Khan's now canonical definition, vastly disproportionate access or control over one kind of resource. So for economic elites, that's wealth, social elites, it's status, and political elites, it's power. And my argument is going to be more generally that families that form these kinship interlocks, they durably entrench themselves in the upper class through the intimate exchange of wealth, status, and power, which both protects them from risk and propels them into more resources. Also argue that these processes of upper class persistence are co-constitutive with systems of sexuality, race, and gender, such that they continually recreate a racially dominant heteropatriarchal upper class. We'll also get more into my data later, but for now I'll give you a preview. I've got this big hand-constructed data set that includes all economic, political, and social elites, the full upper class, and all mutual family ties for Dallas, Texas in its first 122 years, which is 1841 to 1963. But for now, I think it helps to get a bit more into these two women I began with to get a sense of what their families looked like. So Agnes Burke Marshall, the one whose family dropped out, it turns out that she was upwardly mobile, she and her husband both. So they were both the child of working class people. They had 4 kids. Their oldest 3, all sons, ended up being middle or working class like their grandparents. Their youngest, Charlotte, ended up being upper class too. She married another upwardly mobile man. But all of Agnes's grandchildren ended up being somewhere between working and upper middle class. So what we've got here is a pretty classic case of regression to the mean. Like she might have gone to the edge of the distribution, but within a couple of generations, her descendants were back towards the average. But Betty looked really, really different. And there are going to be a lot more colors in this slide. Again, I'll explain it later. But for now, there are labels, and you can just get a general sense that when there are a lot of colors, it's a lot of kinds of elites. So Betty was the child of really wealthy enslavers who were also first cousins, quite common. She married a man named George Aldridge, who was also the child of wealthy enslavers, and they moved to Dallas together where he became district judge, so he was a political elite. They had 3 sons, all of whom ended up being elite in their own right. One was a bank president, one was a president of the fanciest men's club. Sonny was even elected mayor of Dallas. All of them married elite women with a lot of family resources of their own, and all of her grandchildren ended up being either socially elite or socially and economically elite in Dallas. And even today, her great-grandson, Mark, is the mayor pro tem of University Park, which is an incorporated wealthy enclave in the center of Dallas. So again, they look very different. Whereas Agnes was on the margins of the upper class, Betty was very much in a kinship interlock. And again, by that, I mean she had at least one economic, political, and social elite among her close kin. And really, she had a lot of all 3 types. I'm calling these kinship interlocks as a reference to board interlocks, which are certainly the most common way of studying elite networks. And a board interlock forms when organizations share board members. But a kinship interlock forms when these analytically distinct types of elites interlock through family ties. And I'm arguing that they generate upper class persistence through these 2 mechanisms. So they protect kin from economic, social, and legal risk, and they propel them into more wealth, status, and power. We'll get more into these with some really fun case studies later. But for now, you can think of these conceptually as like the protect mechanism is the formation of a kind of multi-dimensional, multi-person safety net. And the propel mechanism is like a multi-dimensional, multi-person process of cumulative advantage. So like the rich get richer. But importantly, both protection and propulsion, they really require kin to follow the rules of the game for kin formation and intimate exchange. So only certain combinations of people can marry, only certain processes can produce legitimate heirs, and particular forms of wealth, status, and power can only flow through particular kin ties. These are mutually constitutive with race and gender and sexuality systems. So how I would sum this up for this population is that they've got to make white straight families and they have to share their resources in normative ways. So like they can make their niece a debutante, but not their nephew, for example. Importantly, seeing these ties and mechanisms, it requires us to fully include women in our analyses, which kind of sounds trite, but it's methodologically difficult and substantively important, so this will come up throughout the talk. All right, so now I've given this introductory example and given you a preview of the argument, so I'll take a step back and give a general theoretical background. Then we'll move into the data and methods, and then I'll do the results. So first we'll do a kind of overall quantitative view of these kinship interlocks in the data set, and then we'll move into the mechanisms, my favorite part, it's the stories. We'll do protect and propel, and then finally I'll wrap up with a summary of what we talked about and some brief implications for the literature. Okay, so with this theoretical background, I'm going to try to cover quite a lot of ground really fast, so I'm going to use this kind of schematic to help us through it. I'll start with kinship networks as a kind of overarching concept, and then we'll move into stratification with elites as a kind of subset of that. And then I'll talk about economic and political sociology under the heading of political economy. So first, kinship networks. If you imagine yourself connected to your family members, and then connected to their family members, and on throughout space and time, then technically we are all connected through one massive, singular, global historical kinship network. This is just true, but it hasn't really been possible to measure this ever. So some parts of this network are a lot more densely entangled than others. You can imagine like a small island or a small town. And some parts have a lot more wealth, status, and power than others, like an aristocracy. We're increasingly able to map portions of this kinship network given ever-increasing access to kinship data. And I think this is really raising this question of how we can use this to help us understand economic, social, and political inequality. So I see this as like part of a larger question in stratification research of how we should measure families in a more complex way. Because traditionally in both stratification and elite persistence studies, like all the old classic stuff, it measures families as parents and children and specifically as fathers and sons. And increasingly people are starting to investigate the effects of mothers, grandchildren, siblings, other kinds of ties, and generally finding that those kinds of ties are important too for adult-child outcomes. This is also part of an effort to make the study of elites a bit more complex, especially in terms of demographic representation. Oh, I forgot this part. Okay, yeah, so the demographer Robert Mayer said, in order to view inequality in a multi-generational perspective, not only do we need new data and models, but we also need to describe new phenomena. And so I'm seeing these kinship interlocks as one of those phenomena. Right, so this is also an effort to be able to see gender and race in a more clear way in the study of elites, because typically what people do is a representation question. So they'll ask, for example, what percentage of billionaires are women? Or what percentage of billionaires are people of color? But we also know from broader research and stratification that in the contemporary US, for example, the higher you go up in a stratification system, the whiter things get, which is kind of what you would expect if you see race and class as interwoven. But also the straighter things get, so the more people are in heterosexual marriages, the more those marriages feature a traditional division of household labor, the more men are likely to control the family wealth, and the more queer children are vulnerable to disinheritance. And all this is kind of more puzzling if you tend to think of gender and sexuality as transversal to class in Melinda Cooper's formulation. I think that what it suggests to me is that both racial domination and a particularly rigid binary gender hierarchy, they together seem to be features and not bugs of the way that stratification is working at the very top. And a way through this, I think, is to think very seriously about kinship, particularly because of two global historical empirical regularities. So elites are not inevitable or universal, but wherever we've got elites, they tend to marry each other, like they really, really like to. And they also tend to produce elite children, at least more often than anyone else, which means that given a particular population, elites in the upper class are really fundamentally structured by family entanglement. And my own work has shown that this can happen in a matter of decades from scratch, given pretty moderate levels of marrying each other and high levels of social mobility. So to sum up this part of the lit review, I would say elite kinship networks, they're a high stakes site for understanding the reproduction of inequality, especially in light of ever increasing access to kinship data. But I'm also speaking to both economic and political sociology. But in doing a network study in economic and political sociology, I'm thinking about networks a bit differently. Traditionally in economic sociology, a network study is conceptualizing a network as a set of ties between market actors, where each tie is a conduit for the flows of information and trust. And in political sociology, it's a set of ties between political elites, where each tie is a conduit for the flows of alliance and conflict. In this article, I'm thinking about intimate ties, so kin ties, and theorizing those ties as a conduit for the flows of wealth, status, and power. And in this sense, I'm drawing on a much more qualitative tradition in these two subfields, especially Viviana Zelzer's The Purchase of Intimacy and Julia Adams's The Familial State, both of which frame the flow of resources through intimate ties as constitutive of political economy in some way. This perspective is a bit unusual because kinship is more typically conceptualized as external to the hardcore of the market and or as irrelevant to democracies, like as something that would only matter in an aristocracy. But I'm also thinking about outcomes. And in this sense, I'm joining a pretty long tradition of studies in both economic and political sociology of tying an abstract network structure to some sort of political or economic outcome. So some heavy hitters in this genre are Granovetter tying weak ties to jobs, Burt tying structural holes to forms of economic advantage, Paget and Ansel tying betweenness centrality to forms of political dominance, and of course the board interlocks literature, which has tied board interlocks to a number of important outcomes, including political collusion, state functioning, and the spread of ultra-high executive compensation. In this paper, I'm tying this abstract structure, these kinship interlocks, to the multi-generational reproduction of economic, political, and social dominance, which is an outcome much more typical of studies in stratification and elite persistence. So to sum this part up, I'd say I tie an abstract kin network structure to the political economic outcome of inequality. So bringing all this together, my work really bridges stratification, economic sociology, and political sociology using the case of elite kinship networks. And the idea here is that elites, by definition, have disproportionate resources. All people tend to share their resources primarily with close kin, which means we can think of elite kinship networks, which are constituted by race and gender and sexuality systems, as a particularly high-stakes site for understanding the long-term reproduction of economic, social, and political domination. Okay, so my research question, one more time, is how do some families manage to entrench themselves in the upper class while others do not? And my argument, and this is the last time I'll make you sit through this. So families that form these kinship interlocks, they durably entrench themselves in the upper class through the intimate exchange of wealth, status, and power, which protects them from risk and propels them into more resources. And these processes are co-constituted with the systems of race, gender, and sexuality, such that they continually recreate a racially dominant heteropatriarchal upper class. Okay, so now we get to move on to data and methods. This data set is hand-constructed. It's kind of complicated, and I love talking about it. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview, but I'm always happy to answer more questions later. I started with these basic descriptive questions of who were the elites and who was in the upper class. And I answered those questions in really, really standard ways. So for the upper class, it's people listed in those fancy books I mentioned, the social registers. I looked at all people who were elected to political office, people on rich lists, that sort of thing. And for each person that could count as elite or upper class by one of these standard measures, I looked them up in a ton of different archival resources to figure out who their family members were, what their demographics were, what kind of stuff they owned, that sort of thing. It's very much like if you've ever known anyone who's done genealogical research for their own families on Family Search or Ancestry Library. I very literally did that, but for 20,000 interconnected people. So all we've got is the first full kinship network of elites in the upper class in a US city. It's a little bit more than 20,000 people. I'm always expanding it based on new questions I have. The population is, this didn't quite show up right, but it's almost all white. It's 99.3% white. And I want to be clear that this is not a sampling problem. It's the full population. Like, this is a white supremacy problem. So this includes all Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people who amassed any kind of significant upper class or elite level resources at the city level for those 122 years. I'm currently working on adding within racial category elites, so not just the richest people in the city, but like the richest Black people in the city, for example, which I'm having to get a lot more creative with the sources, but it's really interesting, and I think it's a great opportunity for collaboration, especially for grad students, so just a plug. But within the upper class, probably the most salient ethno-racial distinction was the one between Christians and Jews. And again, the labels aren't showing up, but the population was about 94% Christian and 6% Jewish, and Christians very much marginalized Jews within the upper class, which is a theme that will come up throughout the talk. Generally, what I do with these data is I've developed a kind of iterative mixed methods approach. So I'll identify population level patterns using network and demographic analyses, often quite simple ones because I've got the full population. Then I'll do qualitative case studies of both representative and non-representative elites and families. So people who fit the pattern, defy the pattern, and everything in between. And I'll iterate back and forth between those until I feel like I really know what's going on. This process, it's like a bit of a graveyard of fun-seeming papers. Like, I'll often find something really cool in like a quantitative analysis, and I'll do the case studies and see that it's like a bit of a statistical mirage, or vice versa. But what it does generate is like a lot of confidence in me that what's going on is really going on. It's robust empirical findings, really testable theories, and portable methods and concepts like kinship interlocks. I promised at the beginning I would get more into the nitty-gritty of these definitions, and now's the time, of elites and upper class status. So for the upper class, again, these are families that collectively have significant wealth, status, and power. And I'm measuring those as anyone listed in these Dallas social registers, which are a pretty standard measure of upper class status in US cities at this time. Like, nothing's perfect, but these are pretty good. So for individuals, these are individuals, or for elites, these are individuals who have vastly disproportionate access or control over one kind of resource. So for economic elites, it's people in the top 1% or at 10 times the median of any surviving wealth distribution I've found. For political, and also people who controlled economic institutions like bank presidents. For political elites, it's anyone elected to political office over those 122 years, and also unofficial power brokers who very conveniently made themselves into a list. For social elites, this is a bit more difficult to measure quantitatively because in Fabian and Commonati's formulation, wealth and power can be seized, but status must be given. So you've got to really think about the audience for the status, who's giving it. And so I'm conceptualizing this as people who had the measurably highest social status among the economic and political elite and among the upper class, which I think is best measured by debutantes, people in the two fanciest clubs, the Idlewild and the Shakespeare Club, and aristocrats. You also might be wondering about the colors. Again, they do have a meaning. I'll explain it, but you don't need to remember this. There are always labels, just if you're curious. So when I show like a family map and a bubble is light blue, like Agnes and Betty at the beginning of the talk, that means they're upper class, but they're not individually elite by one of the measures I've used. And a gray bubble, it's just all the rest of us, very capacious category, middle or working class. These individual kinds of elites are the three primary colors. So economic is yellow like gold, political is red like blood, and social elite is blue like blue blood, which I very recently learned has a super creepy like racialized history, which honestly is appropriate. And so for individuals, when there are more than one type of elite, they're those colors mixed together. So social economic is green, social political is purple, political economic is orange. And when someone's all three types, technically the mix of those colors is white, but that's not really intuitive. So I do a spiky bubble around it to let you know like this is special. And when someone is in a kinship interlock, there's a line around the bubble. They're like locked in. You also might be wondering why Dallas? It's like sort of random. It's a great question. And I want to be clear that I think this sort of study would be fascinating in a number of different settings. Like I'd love to see one on Detroit, for example. But Dallas is one good choice for two main reasons. The first one's about data quality, and the second one is about theoretical promise. You would imagine in building this by hand, I need a relatively manageable population size. So if I tried to do this for New York City, which is kind of the modal choice for studies of elites in the US, a single year of New York's history would be larger than this entire data set. It's just not really possible. But there's also a lot of available searchable data. For example, the power brokers who made themselves into a list. It's also like, I think, pretty theoretically promising. So a lot of what we know about the history of the US upper class is based on cities in the Northeast. But Dallas is like, it's the largest metropolitan area in the former Confederacy. It's the birthplace of the alliance between the Republican Party and the religious right. It's a border state. There are all these important threads of US history that could be tackled with this data set. I'm not gonna get them here, but you could. It's also a settler colonial city, which means that it began as a collection of strangers, which makes it, for the purposes of this paper, a really rigorous case for studying elite family entanglement. So whatever levels of elite family entanglement we see, which, like, spoiler alert, is a lot, you can kind of imagine that in other more established cities, there's a lot more. And I'm doing work at the national level now, and that seems to be quite empirically true. Boston especially is like really, really extreme. You also might be wondering why I couldn't automate this, or if I could automate it now given access to LLMs. And the biggest reason is about the women, and I think it's sort of substantively important, so I'm gonna briefly explain. So what we're looking at here is the very first page of the very first social register in Dallas, these indices of upper class families. It's from 1895. And if I zoom in, you can see people are listed by household and women are listed under their husband's names. So as I was going through and adding each person inside, I would have to look and see, okay, who's Judge G in Aldridge? It's this guy named George. And I had to figure out who he was married to in 1895. So I'd look at all these different resources to figure out, okay, it's this woman named Betty. She's the child of wealthy enslavers who are also first cousins. And then crucially, on this page alone, she's got a sister. And so even though finding these ties took quite a lot of time, it's really the heart of the data set. And I'll show you what I mean. So if I'd used a patrilineal definition of family, like just fathers and sons, which would be much easier to automate and really pretty traditional, especially for studies of elites, then this is what the kinship network would look like. So each dot here is a man and each line is a father-son tie. You can kind of see like some patrilineages are bigger than others, but there's no overall structure. It's a sort of loose soup. When you include women, you can see there's a very clear structure. So it turns out that at least 75% of elites and the upper class were connected through close family ties in this single massive hairball. By close family ties, I mean parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, first cousins, and spouses, which is a set of ties I chose based on qualitative information about the population. Like these are the ties where they're most likely to share a lot of resources. My point here is that fully including women, even though it's methodologically difficult, it allows us to see this kinship network as a continuous social structure rather than as like a bag of households. It also allows us to see it as a location within this global historical kinship network that I mentioned at the top. Now it's finally time to go into the results. So first, again, I'll do this overview of kinship interlocks and the data, then we'll do the case studies. So just to remind you, these kinship interlocks, I'm precisely defining them as a subgraph, which means just a portion of a kinship network composed of people or nodes who are within one kin tie of economic, political, and social elites. So you can conceptualize this as people who had theoretical access or control over all three types of resources through kin, especially for the process of upper class persistence, which tended to be a kind of collaborative family deal. So hypothetically, you can imagine a kind of structure that you've got a billionaire, a senator, a debutante, and their random cousin. All of those would be in a kinship interlock, and I'm assuming that they're all going to share their wealth, status, and power with one another, especially for the purposes of persistence. Again, these are only fully visible if we include women. So if I use the patrilineal network, it would look like hardly anyone had this theoretical access or control over all three types, be just 360 men. But in the full graph, you can see it's 10 times as much. So it's almost 4,000 people had this theoretical access or control. Almost all the people who were in a kinship interlock were in the upper class, and almost all of them were in the family web, that central cluster that they're all connected to. And they were about a fifth of the upper class, so like they're the upper class of the upper class, sort of. They were 100% white, and not only that, they were the most prototypically white, so they were disproportionately Christian, disproportionately Episcopalian, which was like the coolest Christian denomination to be a part of, if you ask them, and disproportionately descended from English immigrants. Sort of like the peak of white prototypicality for this population. So I said at the beginning that Agnes, this one whose family dropped out, she was not in a kinship interlock, and Betty was in a kinship interlock, and her family persisted in the upper class. So what I first want to show you is this pattern held across the full population. They illustrate this pattern that kinship interlocks were especially durably upper class, which is kind of, we would need that to be true if they're generating upper class persistence. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a stress test as a measure of entrenchment. We're going to look at who survived the Great Depression. So I'm going to take all upper class adults in 1910. They were alive in that year. They were in Dallas. They'd been listed in those fancy books. And we're going to see what their kin configuration was in that year. So what kinds of elites were they tied to, if any, at that time? And then we'll break them up into buckets based on that and see the percentage of each bucket that had descendants in the Dallas upper class after 1940. So they're successfully entrenched. And against the full population, so we'll just do means, nothing too fancy. It turns out that about 40% of these upper class adults survived the Great Depression in this way, so more than half dropped out for various reasons. Those like Agnes, who had no known kin ties to elites in 1910, they persisted about half the time, a rate of about 20%. And those like Betty, who were in a kinship interlock, persisted at a really high rate of 82%. But there's like a lot of gradation between that. You could be almost in the kinship interlock with two kinds of elite ties. You could have just one elite tie. And so if kinship interlocks are generating upper class persistence, we'd expect that the closer you were to a kinship interlock, the more persistent you would be. And that's exactly what we find. It's like a very, very clear pattern. So people who are tied to just one kind of elite persist even more often, but those who are tied to great wealth, like the most often persisting, kind of unsurprising given the well-known protective qualities of wealth. For those that were tied to two types of elites persisted even more often, with importantly, those that were tied to social and political elites, but not economic elites, persisting more often than those who were only tied to economic elites. So again, this is exactly what you would expect if kinship interlocks really did generate upper class persistence, but this analysis can't really tell us the how, like how did this work? Was it really kinship interlocks? What were the mechanisms? And for that, I turned to case studies. So I randomly sampled at least 3 and as many as 9 elites at each intersection of kin ties and persistence. This is more precisely what it looked like. And I also did 30 cases randomly sampled from the full upper class population to make sure things were holding outside of that specific historical slice. And I reviewed my very large collection of qualitative sources. So my goal here was really for each case study to bring together all the information I had to kind of tell the story of that family's persistence or non-persistence, like who had what, who was an elite, who wasn't, who shared what with whom, and how did they persist or not, that kind of thing. It's 106 cases in total. I have an appendix that summarizes all of them if you're really interested, but for now, I'm going to go deep into a few cases, and I just want you to keep in mind that these are coming from a very specific sampling frame. All right, so finally, the mechanisms. Okay. So the first thing these kinship interlocks did is they protected kin from economic, legal, and social risk. And the first kind of risk I want to talk about is economic risk. So most of the time from doing the case studies, it seems like being in a kinship interlock, it really meant the absence of any felt risk of downward mobility. So this is Gertrude Aldridge. She's one of Betty from the Beginning's granddaughters. And the stock market actually crashed a week before her debutante ball. But what she said about it later was, we were hardly aware of it. Our plans were all made when the stock market crashed and we went on with our plans. So this is kind of the more typical case. But what I'm going to go in depth into is a case that's really extreme where a family fortune was genuinely lost. And like just anecdotally, before doing this study, I thought this happened all the time based on movies and TV shows and stuff like that. But this is the only such case I've found that seems real in the historical record. So quite rare. It'd be gradual. Anyway, so this woman, Inez Thomas, she was the daughter of Emma Moss, an economic elite, and Mike Thomas, who was all 3 types of elite. And he was a millionaire cotton broker, extremely powerful in Dallas. She was a social elite because she was a debutante, and not only that, she was the lead debutante in the 1919 Idlewild Ball, so very, very fancy. They lived in this massive mansion in the center of Dallas. It's on 7 acres. It's still one of the most prestigious addresses in the city. Like the guy who lives there now is Harlan Crow, who's the Dallas billionaire who was in the news a bunch for like giving gifts to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Yeah, so it's still, everyone always knows who lives there, apparently. It's a big deal. And they would throw these legendary parties, and they split their time between there and London, where Mike had a cotton trading office, and where Inez at one point had even dated the Prince of Wales. So again, extremely fancy. But she ended up settling down with a handsome, supposedly, but penniless carpenter's son. He was really charming, and it was with her family's blessing. And they together had one daughter named Sharon, who Inez gave birth to while wearing a string of pearls. But just after Sharon's birth, disaster struck in the form of the Great Depression. And Mike Thomas's fortune really falls like a house of cards. So there are all these really embarrassing headlines in the New York Times and the Dallas Morning News. And within a few years, Mike is squatting in this empty mansion with no lights, no furniture, and a shotgun warding off potential creditors. So embarrassing. Inez, who'd been largely reliant on her father for money, ends up selling homemade pickles to keep her daughter in the elite girls' private school, Hockaday. Like, they must have been like really nice pickles. I think it was also cheaper then. Anyway, so Inez is doing that. Her husband, Bill, even takes his own life in despair. But Inez manages to keep her social ties during this time. Like, she's still cool. And when the time comes, Sharon gets asked by the men of the elite Idlewild Club to make her debut. But Sharon is like, are you nuts? Like, I can't even pay for parking downtown, much less a debutante ball. And these men were like, you know, Sharon, you're so fancy. Your mom is Inez. Your grandpa was Mike. We've just got to have you make your debut. So we will waive the expectation that you pay for a ball, and we will pay for your parking downtown. So she borrows a dress from her godmother, and she makes her debut in 1949. And in doing this, she's going from being an upper class person, in my formulation, to a social elite like her mother. Within a few months, she meets and marries a wealthy Houston oilman and a kinship interlock of his own, Tom Blake III. And so she has really leapt out of economic precarity here. Because it's community property laws and marrying this economic elite, she's becoming a social and economic elite. So we're going to come back to Sharon because some more stuff happens. But for now, what I'll say is this case demonstrates how the family circulation of wealth, power, and status, it forms this kind of multidimensional safety net. So even in this extreme case, when a family fortune genuinely was lost, power and status, and in this case, especially status, could keep kin in the upper class, keeps the door open. All right, but kinship interlocks, they also protected from legal and social risk. So Gertrude, this one with the stock market debutante ball, it turns out that she'd actually also spent years smuggling crates of very illegal birth control into Dallas for Planned Parenthood. This was an open secret, everyone knew, but no one was going to arrest her because she was Gertrude Alders, because of who her family was. And this is, I mean, depending on your politics, of course, maybe like a kind of benign or good example. But in doing this research, I've come across a ton of examples of really horrible, illegal, scandalous things people in Kinship Interlocks did and got away with. And these are just ones that have survived in the historical record, so we know it's just the tip of the iceberg since they control the historical record. So I found cases of child labor, sex trafficking, wage theft, kidnapping, many, many murders, like in broad daylight, bank robberies, including of the Federal Reserve, embezzlement, tax fraud, and 2 decades of diamond thefts from all the richest women in the city. And that's what we're going to focus on today, keeping it light. Okay, so the King of Diamonds. He's probably the most legendary thief in Dallas history after Bonnie and Clyde, and he operated during the middle of the 20th century. And there were all these headlines about him stealing from the richest women in the city, who were also some of the richest in the world at that time. He was kind of mean. He would go in and steal just one of their earrings, or he would go in and take only the most tasteful things. And some women, he went in and stole nothing, and they were actually kind of upset. But there were all these headlines about him. And in building the data set, I would come across these, and I tried to figure out if they've ever figured out who he was. And they never did until recently. An investigative journalist spent 6 years tracking this guy down. He had died already, so he was never caught in his lifetime. But it turns out it was this man named John T. Higginbotham Jr., and he got away with it because he was born into a kinship interlock. So he was a social elite like Inez, Sharon's mother. He was the president of the Men's Idlewild Club. But Inez's kinship interlock was kind of sparse. It was mostly her father that was giving her the kinship interlock. But John was in this really deep, deep, sprawling one. And I don't have time to get into the whole thing, but I'll give you one brief example. So his father was all 3 types of elite, much like Mike Thomas. And his first cousin, Henry Dickinson Lindsley III, was the grandson of the most powerful mayor in Dallas history. And he was exactly John's age. They went to the same schools their whole lives, and they lived just 2 doors down from each other. And Henry III ended up marrying Chandler Roosevelt, the debutante granddaughter of President Franklin D. and Eleanor Roosevelt. So very, very well connected. What this journalist who figured out it was him said about them was the Higginbothams didn't just know the right people, they were the right people. And I think that this is empirically true. It turns out the Dallas detectives actually knew it was John. They'd followed his signature waffle print shoe prints all the way to his front door. That's the actual detectives, by the way. But John lived in Highland Park, which is a wealthy incorporated enclave in the center of Dallas with its own local government. And because of John's family's power and status, the Highland Park police chief refused to give them a warrant. He also called his buddy in the Dallas police office, and the investigation screeched to a halt. So John was never caught. I want to point out that this is not a simple matter of wealth. So some of the women he stole from are really orders of magnitude richer than anyone in his family. It was really the multidimensionality of this kinship interlock that saved him. So his family's comparatively colossal local status and power brought the investigation to a halt. I think what I'll say more generally here is that kinship interlocks can protect kin from legal and social risk, even in this very extreme circumstance of stealing from other rich people. But, and this is a very important but, John may have gotten away with really extravagantly breaking the law in this case, but when he broke those rules of the game that I mentioned at the top, there began to be some material consequences. So you might remember I summarized these rules of the game for this population as you've got to form a white straight family, you've got to share your resources in normative ways. Well, this was a bit of a problem for John because John was secretly gay. At first, he was really diligently following the rules. He was not acting gay. He took women out on dates. He joined an exclusive fraternity, the one known as the Most Masculine. He got a job at the family company. He even proposed to a maximally white upper-class woman. She was a thin, blonde, blue-eyed debutante who was so zealously gender-conforming she hated when women wore pants. And she told reporters this multiple times. But a month before the wedding, we don't know why, she broke things off. And John was devastated. Friends said that this rebuff ended his dream of the perfect family, and he began to change his life. So he quit his job, new outfit. He left the family home, and he invested much of his inheritance in real estate. He took it out of the family business. He also began openly spending more time in the Dallas gay community. But as he was inching away from heteronormativity, he was also inching away from the protective cocoon of his family's kinship interlock. So one example is his fortune took a bit of a nosedive during a real estate bust, and so he started a lawn care service to make ends meet, which none of his siblings and cousins were having to do. Reportedly, his childhood friends, quote, looked the other way as he drove through his former neighborhood with his lawn care crews. He moved into a modest apartment, which he filled with exotic pets, plants, and art, and he died in 1997, officially of heart failure, but I think very likely of AIDS. I think this kind of extreme case, it suggests that for an heir in a kinship interlock, at least in this place in time, lived queerness could be a bigger threat to wealth, status, and power than literally grand larceny. I also think it helps us understand this perhaps puzzling gender conservatism of the elite and upper class. So the enormous incentives for following these rules of the game and the significant consequences for breaking them may be continually recreating a heteronormative elite and upper class. All right, so now moving into the second mechanism, propel. So these kinship interlocks, like persistence, it wasn't just about protecting from risk, it was also about steadily amassing more resources. And these kinship interlocks did that too. And for this, we're gonna go back to Sharon. So when we left off, she had hastily married this Houston oilman and leapt out of economic precarity. But within a couple of years, she divorced this man and moved back to Dallas with their young daughter, where she soon met and married an even richer man, this guy named Pollard Simons. He would eventually become a billionaire. And Pollard was fabulously wealthy, but he had a secret, which is that he was born Jewish. But it wasn't quite secret enough because whispers about his Jewish ancestry meant he was excluded from the most elite social clubs in Dallas. He couldn't join the Idlewild Club. But in marrying Sharon, he could immediately access high status through her. So this multi-person, multi-dimensional propelling process begins, where through their gendered labor, her legendary hosting, his wheeling and dealing, her status is increasing his wealth and power is increasing her wealth and status, and before we know it, he's golfing with President Nixon and Bob Hope. He also becomes very close with President Eisenhower, so he's gone from being just an economic elite to being a political and economic elite. He's got these presidents on speed dial. Sharon is getting full-page spreads in Vogue because she's, for example, hosting the Spanish dictator Franco's daughter in Dallas. And you remember this mansion that her grandpa had pretty dramatically lost. Well, the mansion next door, which is arguably even fancier, went up for sale, and Pollard, in gratitude for all this marriage had done for him, he buys it. So Sharon is quite literally restored to the position of her birth. So this case is demonstrating how by assiduously following these rules of kin formation and intimate exchange, they propelled each other into the international elite. And I think more generally, we can say that the gendered circulation of resources in these kinship interlocks can propel kin into more resources. But, another but here, the propelling processes, they were not a free-for-all. So no matter how rich, high status, or powerful someone was, they couldn't make just anyone kin, and they could only match certain kinds of resources to certain kinds of people and relations. So to illustrate this idea, I'm going to go back to Betty from the very, very beginning, a bit of a prequel story about her uncle/cousin breaking the rules of the game. So it turns out that Betty had moved to Dallas on the heels of a pretty massive family scandal. It made the state level and national level news. Her maternal uncle/first cousin once removed, Samuel R. Hearn, he was another really wealthy enslaver, and he lived just 2 plantations over from her and her parents in Hearn, Texas. He was very rich, but to his white family's dismay, he never married a white woman and produced a white heir like he was supposed to. Instead, he lived with the woman he enslaved named Azaleen and their biological son named Doc. He was like the second richest man in the state at this time, and so his white family assumed that when he died, they would be inheriting everything that he owned. But when Sam died in 1866, just 1 year after Juneteenth, or the first year of emancipation in Texas, he left a will leaving everything to Doc. This outraged and embarrassed his white brothers and cousins to the point that they totally excised Sam from their really creepily extensive genealogical records, which of course had never included Doc in the first place. And using a series of pretty vicious legal attacks, the White Hearns severed this kin tie and stole the wealth flow that consecrated it. And Doc died of yellow fever a few years later, leaving everything to Azaleen. So they're there fighting against Azaleen, and she fought back using every plausible tool, but ultimately she died penniless in the same year that Betty gave birth to her son Sonny, who would become mayor of Dallas. So this case is not unusual in terms of the nation as a whole, and also in terms of the kinds of fights that went on in Dallas over the flow of resources. And I think in general, what I would say is that by continually regulating these proper matches of properties and positions to persons, white upper class families, they simultaneously reproduced whiteness, heterosexuality, and upper class status. And these efforts were not marginal to this process of upper class persistence, they were really core to the whole thing. Okay, so we've gotten through the case studies, and now I'm going to give a brief summary and go through some implications. So my research question again was, how do some families manage to entrench themselves in the upper class while others do not? We talked about how just as corporate interlocks connect corporations through shared board members, kinship interlocks connect to social locations' richest, highest status, and most powerful people through family. This is really Betty's dining room, by the way. Just as corporate interlocks generate corporate collusion, ultra-high executive pay, that sort of thing, kinship interlocks generate upper-class persistence. We talked about how they can protect kin from permanent downward mobility, even when a family fortune is lost, which suggests that upper-class persistence is a multi-person, multi-dimensional process that cannot be reduced to wealth or men alone. They can protect kin from legal and social risk, even in extreme circumstances. I think this means that the family concentration of great wealth, status, and power, it continually creates a class of people that's largely free to exploit and steal at will. So you remember this list of horrible things that they did and got away with. The circulation of wealth, status, and power in a kinship interlock can propel kin into more resources, but both protection and propulsion required kin to follow the rules of the game for kin formation and intimate exchange. And not everyone was equally able or willing to follow those rules. Those who were less able or willing to conform did not receive the same rewards of protection and propulsion as their more compliant kin. The enormous incentives for following these rules and the significant consequences for breaking them continually recreated a racially dominant, heteropatriarchal elite and upper class. So just as racial domination is a strategy of wealth defense and resource extraction, so too is heteropatriarchy. Both are really central to this process of upper class persistence. I think we can think of upper class persistence then as a kind of continual choreography of conformity and exclusion, such that despite many individual failures and rebellions and refusals, people die and the upper class does not. These patterns, processes, and mechanisms, of course, are only fully visible through the systematic inclusion of women. So getting into some brief implications, I'm going to use this schematic I used at the beginning to move through them. So in terms of kinship network stratification and elites, I mentioned at the top that we're all connected through this global historical kinship network, and as more kinship data is becoming available, it's raising this question of how we can use these kinship networks to study inequality. I think this project has made me really wonder how the family flows of wealth, status, and power would look across a full population, or a completely different inheritance system, or a different political structure, or a different kinship system for that matter. Especially because, hypothetically, given the exact same distribution of resources across individuals, the spread of resources across a kinship network could vary quite widely with serious potential consequences. So you can imagine this extreme hypothetical where you've got a set of elites, the same amount of resources for the same number of elites, and in one society, they're all clustered in a few families, and in another one, they're more randomly spread throughout the network. You could even think of this as a sort of ideal typical difference between an aristocracy and a meritocracy. My point is that when we measure inequality only in terms of individuals, as with Agnes and Betty at the beginning of this talk, we can't tell the difference. I think there are also some implications for political economy, and I'll be very, very brief with this. So I hope that these findings motivate the continued and systematic reintegration of kinship with political economy. Because kinship is not, I'm sorry for the jump scare, but kinship is not and has never been a mere marginality to the world of markets and politics. Monarchs, presidents, billionaires, and CEOs, they all entrench themselves in part by funneling wealth, status, and power toward their kin. So I think that kinship interlocks, they're really the cradles of many tycoons and tyrants. Like, this is where they come from. And if they don't come from them, they're going to try to make them before they die. Like, they're the graves of most. So the thought that I want to leave you with is that when it comes to the long-term dynamics of economic, social, and political domination, family is still where the action is. Thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah, so great stuff. I have a question about the race angle.
Yeah.
Well, I have two questions. But, it seems like, so you're data go up to the early 1960s. It's interesting that you found that particular case, and there must be a handful of other cases, but it seems to me that race is completely irrelevant to that history, because it's just that's the way the world was. I think it might be interesting to see between 1960 and today whether, I'm guessing there still isn't very much integration, but there must be some now where you didn't see it at all then. So I just wonder if, I guess if you could say something. The other question I had, though, was about the necessary and sufficient conditions of these different elites. So the one chart that partially answered my question was the one where you show that if you're a combination of two of them, you end up with more benefits. I guess I wonder how much, what the necessary and sufficient conditions are, because there's a certain percentage, even if you're only in one of these groups, there's a certain percentage that seems to be protected.
Mm-hmm.
And there must be something about that group, the group of, if it's just economic elites or it's just social elites, the group that's protected, what it is about those who only have the one that allows them to stay connected. And I don't know if it's just all explained by kinship, because the top bar was the kinship, but just one other quick point about that.
Okay.
It seems to me, the kinship to me, I think you're right that this is really where the action is, but I also think that there's even something more fundamental than that, and that is just, it's junior high school, or middle school. You're either in or you're not.
Totally.
And even being able to remarry, like that one who divorced her husband, in 2 years, that was part of, she was in the cool group, and she was able to. So, I don't know how you measure that other than kind of affect, or people, this one rates and that one doesn't. The other last thing is, I'll bet there were a lot more gay people than you discussed here, but a lot of them just kind of went through the motions and then,
Totally.
decide.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. I think I'll take those in reverse order. I think first of all about the gay people, totally. Like there are a lot. I think there are a lot that I'll never know. I've been keeping a list and making the data set of ones that seem pretty gay based on the history of the time. Like 2 ladies who lived together for decades, left their fortunes to each other, and drove around in the same car with their names painted on the side. Like if that's not gay, I don't know what is. But I've got a rating system of how sure I am. But I think that what you're pointing to is the key here, which is that there may be people who have desires that we'll never know about, that did not fit what they were supposed to fit, but who lived their life as if they were straight. And that's what these kinship interlocks were really asking of them. So what they were doing behind closed doors, that was different than who they were marrying and who they were giving their property to. In terms of the junior high school stuff, I think totally. This is all, it's like a small social world. They all knew each other, much like today. I have one of the many, many papers one day I'd like to do, especially for grad student wanting to do a lot of the data stuff, is looking at yearbooks for who won most popular in or the other kinds of favorites in these years, and seeing where they were positioned in their family networks at the time, how that contributed to being elected, and then what happened to them later on. Because it's like they're sitting on the bank board with their friends from junior, like you're saying. It's very close. In terms of the necessary and sufficient conditions, maybe it'd be helpful to show this slide. These are case study themes, sort of a 2x2. So mostly we were focusing on persistent kinship interlocks and cases of non-persistence within a persistent kinship interlock. But I think we were talking is about the people who are persistent but not in a kinship interlock, this bottom left corner. So those that, So in those case studies, generally a lot of the time what happens is they formed a kinship interlock over time. So they're continually amassing resources. It's a lot of endogamous marriages and even marrying up. And typically, the most dramatic cases, they often formed a family business, which would secure their wealth over time. So in the paper, I talk about Meyer Lichtenstein, his daughter's husband and sister and brother-in-law started Neiman Marcus. And that's what really entrenched them, even though they had no elite ties to begin with. And then in terms of the race question, I think The fact that this is so white means it's very much about race. Like there's like a lot of selection going on. And the case with Betty, it was actually quite common. That's why there were so many laws against interracial marriage, and eventually a law that if you were white, your Black biological heirs could not inherit. That was, I forget the year exactly they instituted that, but they wouldn't have had to make these laws if it wasn't happening quite a bit. And I think that I share your intuition that'd be really interesting to see what this looks like in different places and times, like so forward in time here, and also in like different systems of racial domination. And I really hope that someone will do a study like that so we can see. Okay.
Yeah, so wonderful talk. I love this and I learned a lot and I'm very excited by this research. So I have a question that I think is kind of pointing to your agenda in terms of putting kinship and political economy together, which I fully endorse. And I want to, I think it's a conceptual question, which has to do with the idea of the interlock, kinship interlock. So the way I understand what you're doing with kinship interlock, it's a kind of analogy between corporate organizations and familial structures. Right? And there's reasons why that analogy works. These are both sites of hierarchical authority. But it is, as I understand it, it's an analogy. One thing is like the other, and therefore you can kind of move a concept that's been developed in the context of board interlocks over to a familial structure of relations. I'm kind of wondering about how you think about instances where this isn't, in terms of thinking about kinship and political economy, where this isn't so much an analogy, but actually a more direct relationship. And so I'm thinking of Melinda Cooper's work and her recent writings on what she calls patrimonial capitalism, in which she's referring to kind of return to older forms of wealth building and asset holding, the kind of return of the family founder firm, where wealth is privately held, corporations are privately held within family groups. And, to the extent that you basically avoid public markets to raise capital, or you do so in a way that retains private familial control. So I guess my question is, would that kind of, that seems more like a less of an analogy, and again, more of a direct relationship between familial forms of concentration of power and corporate structures. And does your analysis kind of lead you to that? Does that intersect with the story you're telling?
Totally. A wonderful question. Thank you. I think Melinda Cooper's work on patrimonial capitalism is super relevant to all of this. Like this analysis has been, I'm like assuming that they're sharing their wealth, status, and power in a relatively flat way. But of course, there are huge inequalities within families, a lot of times tied to who controlled the wealth, what form the wealth was in, that sort of thing. So I think it's no accident that a lot of the ones that weren't in a kinship interlock and had a family business ended up being quite entrenched, because that form of wealth really pressured people to act in the way that they were supposed to in order to preserve their family wealth. So like John T. Higginbotham Jr., he was vulnerable in part because he took his wealth out of the family business, but he took his wealth out of the family business so that he could be gay, It's all kind of like interwoven. I think a lot of what Cooper talks about is like how this return, it's like really inhibiting, or I remember some passages at least, where she's like, it controls the behavior of people. So like if all your wealth is in a family business, it's harder for people to leave home or rebel against their parents, that sort of thing. I think it'd be really fascinating to do a study like using these data, looking at who owned a family business over time, and how the business was structured, who had what jobs, that sort of thing, and how that affected persistence processes and the class as a whole. Cool.
Feel free to say asked and answered, but I want to invite you to say maybe a little bit more about Mark's first question about the race component. As I heard it or interpreted, and you can tell me if it's wrong, he was trying to say, well, given the time, it's not surprising or it's obvious that it'd be so white, this sort of group. And your response, as I understood it, was something along the lines of, well, a lot of these folks were enslavers, there were potential heirs that could have been part of these networks, but they were sort of boarded off. And so I guess what I was trying, or what I'd be curious to hear more about or invite to speak a little bit more on is like why it's not obvious. I feel like I got some things on there, but I want to hear it maybe from you more concretely. One of them is sort of like pulling on this mechanism of the protect mechanism, part of that protection was playing in the rules of the game, and that meant sort of the racially homogenous kind of network and that kind of thing. It's like, that's what's going on. What makes this sort of not obvious? Like, what is the alternative world that would have been more heterogeneous that this stuff you're talking about has sort of made an active role to make it less obvious that it was so white? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I think that it's about the protect and propel mechanism for sure, like following the rules of the game, but there's also the step before that of who becomes an elite and the processes for becoming an elite. So these, like the social elite status, I've mentioned it, these are groups that only allow white Christians most of the time. So like that's a very, straightforward like exclusion mechanism. For economic elites, it was like a lot more complicated, but there were a lot of white people working together to hoard wealth and Black men were basically excluded from the oil industry, for example. And then in terms of political power, it's interesting that you see a moment in the 1870s where there were Black political elites as there were across the country. And so they're in the data set, but they couldn't form a kinship interlock because they didn't have access to wealth or power in the same way. And so I think like moving forward in time, I'd be really interested in seeing what happens like as some of those levers to wealth and power in particular, the access broadens a bit, but like social elite status in Dallas in the upper class is still extremely white. I think the Dallas Country Club let a Black member in for the first time in 2013, like something.
Guys, a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Are there alternative to the like debutante balls, the sort of like Jack and Jill stuff, or is there any other kind of
exactly.
like alternative institutions
Totally.
post-60s were developed?
So this is what I'm trying to do with the within racial category elites. There was a Black debutante ball called the Idlewild Ball, but 2 words instead of 1. So I've collected as much as I can of who were those debutantes. I'm adding them to the data set. There was a Jack and Jill chapter. There's a lot more. I'm having to think about status in a more creative way. I think like being a teacher meant something very different in the Black community, for example. But yeah, this is what I mean by getting more creative with sources. And I think it'd be interesting to see like if there's sort of like within racial category kinship interlock mechanism that's going on, or if you need a kind of absolute level of resources at the city level to get that persistence.
Thank you for the amazing talk. I really enjoy it, and I'm really interested in the 2 mechanisms you talked in. And I'm just wondering, like, to what extent these 2 mechanisms operate differently in the kinship network, and specifically, like, whether the mechanisms of the persistence will depend on the types or the diversity of the kinship ties. Say if we have 2 families, like kinship systems, like kinship systems A and B. In the A, we saw like most of people economic elites, but in the B, we see a cluster of both economic and political ties.
Yeah.
Do you think like the kinship system B will be more likely to proper people than the A?
Yeah. So I hear you asking us about like how do these resources work differently in families? Am I understanding that?
Yes, and whether like the combination of different different ties, different types of ties would influence the mechanisms.
Yeah, totally.
Like whether in some families it's more likely to be the propulsion instead of the protection.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I haven't thought about that, and I'm going to now. So thank you so much. I think I'll say in general, like one of the directions I want to take the research and get another direction is like really getting into the nitty gritty of what these different types of resources did, and even different types of power within power, for example. And it seems like from the case studies, just sort of generally, like to use like a horribly mixed metaphor here, the wealth seems to be kind of the gas, like they can't really go anywhere without some kind of access to wealth. The power seems to be a bit of a guardrail. So like you saw with John Higginbotham, like not getting caught, I think that was like very much about his ties to power. There's another wild case of the sheriff robbing the Federal Reserve, and that was also very much power. And then the status seems to be like on the level of the kinship network, it's like a glue. So it keeps sectors of the kinship network stuck there, like how we saw with Sharon. And on like kind of an individual level, it's like an open door. So you still need kind of to get power and wealth eventually, but it keeps the options open, if that makes sense. So I would guess like probably in terms of the propel, if we're going to go combinations of 2, social and economic would probably be the most effective, but I think it would also depend on the level of power. Like if you're elected governor, it's very different being on city council, for example.
Amazing talk. Probably like my favorite talk I've seen in years. Unbelievable. Building off of the wealth is the gas. So 1935, you have the big inheritance tax or the state tax
Yeah.
expansion to 75% tax level,
Mhm.
tax rate. Do you see, well, I guess two related questions. One, do you have a sense of the asset portfolio of these families or individuals? And two, do you see or can you see sort of an effect of this, of the estate tax in
Totally.
kind of severing the gas or having an effect? Yeah.
Totally. Such a great question. I'm like, every day I feel sad that I don't have systematic wealth panel data on all these people. I think it'd be so cool. The wealth data I have is like sort of scattered, and it's, I mean, I guess with most data, like there are a lot of confounding factors, so it's difficult to disentangle. Like in the 1930s in particular, there was, you know, a wealth tax, but there was also this huge oil boom that was taxing some of the richest in the world, and oil was taxed much differently than other kinds of stuff, which is part of why they got so rich. But yeah, I think in the sort of the dip in inequality in mid-century, it seems like I don't have like full data going all the way to the present day, but like lifespans are pretty long and a lot of these people are still alive. And it seems like over time, this hairball kind of loosens. And based on, I'm like tracking current debutante balls and stuff, it seems like it's tightening up again. And so I think that the inheritance tax, my guess would be that it helps loosen the hairball a bit by preventing the concentration of wealth quite so much. But I don't know for sure yet, and I wish I did. Just their asset portfolios, they really varied. Like some own family businesses. Like, I'm thinking about, I did this whole inheritance paper where I was reading like all the things they owned in their probate records. So a lot of like land, mansions, and there was like a gender component to it as well. Women tended to own like durable consumption assets like mansions and jewelry, and men it was more businesses, and it got split up. It's a great question.
And they weren't publicly traded companies typically.
Later on, yes. I don't know exactly like the dates when all that started. Again, like a study of family business would be awesome. There's a lot like 7-Eleven, Neiman Marcus, like a lot of big oil companies. And you could link it to the data. It'd be pretty cool. It's, you know, anyone can use it if you want. Just text me.
Perfect. So thank you so much. I wanted to ask about the mechanisms that create the sort of heteropatriarchy at the very top and sort of enforce that. And I guess the question that I had, so I can see very clearly via the stories you described of how the consequences to breaking the rules of the game are like much, you know, just like bigger for these, or the potential rewards for following them, maybe is the best better way to say that, are like
Big
larger.
carrot, small stick.
Yeah, something like that. And so that seems like it would, I can see how that would, whatever the rules of the game are, that would reinforce that behavior more strongly among the elites than among the upper class more generally, and then among everyone in particular, or everyone in general. But I was curious, it seems like you're also arguing, and I can see why this would, or like I can see the sort of why this would be true, but I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about how it works, of like that specifically that the rules of the game, they construct the rules of the game for them to be more heteropatriarchal because that is helpful for the perpetuation of their elite status. And I guess, so I'm curious, like, is that what you're arguing? And if so, could you describe a little bit more about specifically what's driving that?
Totally. Yeah. I think it comes from like a lot of different directions. I think in studying elites just in general, it's like competitions all the way down. Like they love ranking each other. It's like they're like always electing someone king or queen of some festival. Like once you get into the Idlewild Club, there's a competition for president of the Idlewild. Like it's like, and so I think that this is really, it's another way to rank each other by who is best and who's worst. So when people like, you know, for example, like sometimes women would run a business, but that was like less high status for their family. So they're like kind of violating this gendered labor norm. And there's incentive for them to hide their involvement in businesses, like to up their family status and therefore their wealth and power and that sort of thing. But like in terms of it was also like there's the legal system as well. So like gay marriage was not legal, for example. There were like really gendered property laws, like all this kind of stuff that added together to create this big carrot, small stick situation for how people were supposed to act. I think also because like they had so many resources, especially for men, like had a lot of privacy to do what they wanted on the side, you know. So John like tried to marry a woman, and I think he's kind of probably just be doing some secret stuff for the rest of his life. Like he had these friends who did that, but he ended up going a different way, obviously. Yeah, I think it's kind of multi-pronged.
So that, yeah, a lot of that seems like it's sort of like the rules of the game are being set kind of separate from the elites themselves. It's not like they're creating them.
Yeah,
Or it's kind of both.
It also is like they're also the judges and lawyers and legislators, you know. So they are quite literally making the laws in a lot of cases, and they're like actively like when I read one of my favorite sources is self-published memoirs. They're so unvarnished. But there are a lot of like people will be gossiping about each other and they'll say things like, you know, the way he dressed was pretty effeminate, or like, you know, the way they're like policing each other's gender and each other's relationships in this huge way. So I do think they're doing it themselves, and it's coming from outside. It's like all of it together, but all of it's driven by this need to like constantly rank each other and like get more than their neighbor kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks, Shay, so much for this talk. This is really great. I have, well, one comment is, as you're thinking about getting into that sort of within racial categories, Joe Guzman at Clark University has done some work on Mayor Makers Clubs, which are sort of Black elite social organizations.
Cool.
And he's digging more into like Bronzeville neighborhoods as like a like Black top thing.
They had the Bronzeville mayor every year in Dallas. Yeah.
So like
okay.
if you know, as you're looking for people doing this kind of stuff, or getting thoughts on Joe's a great resource. And then the question is, thinking about heterogeneity and sort of variation, especially across place, right?
Yeah.
I'd like to focus on Dallas, but that obviously then raises the question, and you sort of gestured to Boston. And I'm curious about how you think about the factors that shape, one, the like interlocks, but also shape the effectiveness or efficacy of the different mechanisms. So
Totally.
do you think of the protect or propel being stronger, weaker in the Boston case when networks are tighter? Like, how do you think about sort of variation and how this might differ across, especially sort of cities and places?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. I think it's because I'm working on this national level data set in part because I wanted to be able to really see the Dallas stuff in context in an empirical way. And I'm really interested in these kinds of like connections and differences between geographic settings. And my sense so far is it's sort of like this kind of like networked or a nested settler colonial structure where like what's different is as you get closer to the center, where you go, the propel mechanism changes. So like in the Dallas data, a lot of people who came from small towns, they form a little kinship interlock in their small town, their mayor of the little town, they're richest in that little town, and then they move to Dallas and connect up. And then in Dallas, like, you know, they'll marry into the New York or the Boston elite. And then in New York and Boston, they marry into the aristocracy of some European country a lot of the time. And the protect mechanism, I'm not really sure how it varies by place, but it'd be really interesting to see. I mean, like the sort of the laws for how you can share wealth and power with kin vary, like the systems of racial domination vary, like Louisiana and California are really different in a lot of interesting ways in how the kinship network looks, but I hope I'll be able to answer that more fully, like with the big data set.
Thank you so much for this really exciting talk. I was also interested in kind of how you're thinking about variation over time and place.
Yeah.
And in terms of place, I was curious whether you were thinking bigger than just a national study, right? In the sense that, you know, one of the themes you kind of bring up in the talk is like aristocracy versus democracy, right? So like, would this actually just look different? You know, like you're showing that these mechanisms exist in Dallas, but are they more or less intense, or do they operate according to different mechanisms, or is the importance of like social like status and right, like status and power more important, let's say, in England today than it was in Dallas, right? So I was just curious in terms of like national level comparisons, if you had thought about that as a way to get leverage on some of these kind of bigger questions, because I love the portability of this method as a way to empirically observe these dynamics that we all talk about, but we actually have very little traction to like actually concretely say like, oh, there's more or less, right? Like of this mechanism here versus here. So I was curious on that kind of like cross-national comparison. And then over time, I was struck by I like to think historically, right? So I was struck both by like how exciting your time frame is, but also that when you present the data, you pretty much give it to us in like one lump sum.
Totally.
Like this is right. So I was curious, especially as kind of maybe the economic base of Dallas changes, whether you observed kind of the power of different, mechanisms, like waning or waxing over time, especially from like an agricultural to, I don't know if I want to call it industrial. Like I'm even curious how you think about, kind of the economic base of Dallas, how you would kind of characterize and periodize that, and whether you, over this time period that you're observing, and whether you see that mapping onto kind of variation within the mechanisms you're observing in your data set.
Completely.
Yeah.
Two great questions. So the first one in terms of variation in terms of place, I mean, I think that it'd be so cool to do some comparisons. I think I want to do it in two ways. So the first is like in thinking relationally and like in terms of building this larger data set. The national level data set is based on all the millionaires in the US in the first Gilded Age. And then I build out from there with their kinship ties using Wikidata. But it's like still international kind of accidentally because the dead center of the network, at least so far, I'm like 80% done, is the British aristocracy. Because like an heiress in Cleveland was more likely to marry a duke than an heir in Portland, Oregon, kind of. And so it's like this really quite literally colonial structure. And a lot of people have written that it's the Gilded Age when this started to happen, but it's actually continuous. It happens from the beginning of the United States. Like the early rich people were like second sons a lot of the time, British aristocrats. So I want to be able to think about it as this settler colonial structure that's much more international. But I also think a straightforward comparison would be amazing. And the British aristocracy, I think, is kind of the lowest hanging fruit for this because a lot of those networks are digitized already. They've got like great wealth data. They've got the titles for the status and they've got parliament stuff. And so I think that it would be a fantastic project for someone to compare those in a direct way, especially because like a lot of the theory on the US elite, like especially the classic stuff, it starts off by being like, well, we're not the British aristocracy, which makes me wonder like what the difference really was. And like a point of comparison with backwater would be especially interesting. Then in terms of overtime change, for sure, like there's like a lot of important change over time that happens. Like 1841, the first year, it was just one white guy by a river. And so the biggest change that happens over time is the formation of this web. But I think like in terms of the economic basis, like the folk narrative of economic change in Dallas is that it was cotton and then it became oil. And there was this like old like cotton and slavery money that got overtaken by these newfangled oilmen. And I have this paper I thought I finished the R&R after this talk, but like it's the first paper I wrote, so I'm like sort of sick of it. But it's called The New Money Myth because it's looking at cotton and oil in the Dallas data, and basically like they were very continuous cotton and oil because it's about land ownership. It was all rich boys, and it was whatever. But I think that what changed is not so much that like cotton people fell out of the elite and oil people arrived. It was more that cotton people became oil people and they became rich on the national stage for the first time. So they're all of a sudden making national rich lists and that sort of thing, which then means that things like Sharon and Pollard, when they're propelling them to a more international stage, which probably wouldn't have happened around 1900. It'd be more New York. Great. So much. Yeah.
I think I'm curious about, both because I lack context, especially changing sort of social dynamics, is the role, like both the legal and social role of marriage, divorce, and things like prenups. And so, within your time frame, you have sort of liberalization of divorce in a couple of periods in the 1920s. You see a sort of uptick, and then again right at the end of your period. I'm wondering if you could leverage that to sort of see how changes in that sort of social and legal atmosphere are, but also in things like it became a much more legally important thing in terms of inheritance and defining things. So prenup agreements, I'm sure, at some point became much more common. And so I'm just wondering how all of that interacts with how people are making these decisions to marry, if they are or aren't making the decision to divorce, to have these prenups, things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would love for someone to do this with my data. I've got like, it's nearly complete on whether people divorced or died in terms of like the marriage's end. And it'd be really interesting to see how, like the divorce prevalence increases over time. And there are some people who seem to get really addicted to marriage and divorce. It's like 7 or 8 by the time of like the 20s or so. But it'd be interesting to see like what this does to the network and to wealth over time, for sure. I'm not really sure when prenups started being a thing. I know one really important legal institution in terms of Dallas history is that it's a community property state, Texas is. So it gave women a lot more power within their marriages than they would have in New York, for example. And in like memoirs and stuff, this comes up a lot. Like they say that they're glad they're in Texas because they like, you know, they can threaten their husbands with divorce kind of thing. And divorce laws are also a bit, it was easier to get divorced in Texas than it would be in New York or something. So maybe like, you know, a comparison to the British aristocracy could be an extreme sort of like way to see how this works because the property laws were totally different there. It was much harder to divorce. Men owned whatever their wives owned before the marriage of thing. But an overtime thing in Dallas would also be awesome. You know, if you want the data, it's all yours.
I'm thinking a little bit about educational prestige in all of this. You made one reference to kind of a primary private school in Dallas. I'm thinking about Highland Park as having an independent school district. Also thinking about kind of changes in university attendance, other private clubs within university systems. Thinking also too about change in debutante balls versus perhaps women's Greek life in Dallas, or even the rise of institutions in Dallas area like SMU versus intentionally sending kids to out-of-state prestigious schools. I was curious how that came up in your data or how you're thinking about that within the establishment of these kinship networks too.
Great question. I don't have complete educational data yet. It's another thing I'm desperate for a grad student to do. I bet it's pretty good for about half of them. And one thing I really want to know is exactly this issue. Like it's very clear to me like which sororities at UT and SMU and fraternities were most prestigious. You know, there was like a top 3 and they sort of had different flavors. There was the one that John T. Higginbotham, the Diamond Thief, was in, the fraternity at UT is the one that like creates most of the governors and Supreme Court justices and stuff. It's like the masculine one. But yeah, like it's not really clear to me if it was more prestigious to be like a Pi Phi at SMU or to go to Wellesley. I think it might have been like different kinds of status and opened up different sorts of doors, but that would be like an amazing kind of paper to look at. Like if it, you know, local status versus national level status, what was more effective in different ways for families' outcomes and how they made that choice be awesome.
Great. We are at time, so please join me in thanking